Hello, I'm Edmund Saddington. I'm a baritone specialising in early music, both as a consort singer and also as a soloist. I'm going to share a short video with you about the life of George Friedrich Handel and his influence on the oratorio, particularly the oratorios that he wrote during his time in England. If you're unfamiliar with the term oratorio, think of an unstaged opera, often with a religious text. Various characters are played by vocal soloists, and there is also a chorus and there's also an orchestra. In an oratorio, the chorus plays a central role and there is generally no interaction between the main characters. There are also no props and there are no costumes. During this video, you'll hear examples of arias by Handel, and I'll introduce those as we head along the video. George Friedrich Handel was born in Halle, which was then part of Brandenburg, Prussia, on the 23rd of February 1685. He was the son of a respected barber surgeon, also called George, who served the influential court of Saxe-Weissenfels, and his mother, Dorothy Taust, was the daughter of a Lutheran minister. There are various stories suggesting that Handel's father was vehemently opposed to his son's music making, and as a result, forbidding him any musical instruments in the home. This, we are told, led to the young Handel hiding a clavichord in an upstairs room, which he would sneak away to and play while his family were asleep. As romantic an idea as this is, it's thought that this could have been purely the poetic imagination of Handel's first biographer, John Mannering. What we do know for certain is that Handel was an exceptional keyboard player, and he was tutored privately in the city of Halle. Here, Handel began composing music to be performed in the city's famous Marktkirche, and he also met the composer Telemann. Telemann was studying law at the university, and Handel was also enrolled there. Telemann later wrote that they frequently visited one another and wrote to each other about compositional techniques. In 1703, Handel had moved to Hamburg and was working as a violinist and a keyboard player in the city's opera house. Here he produced his first two operas, Almira and Nero, both in 1705. Following this, Handel travelled to Italy, apparently visiting Florence before heading on to Rome. In Rome, opera had been temporarily banned by the Papal States, so Handel composed sacred music for the Roman clergy. Here he composed Dixit Dominus, one of his most famous works, and also composed cantatas in his famous pastoral style. This was where he wrote his first two works, which have been described as oratorios. Both were written in Italian, La Resurrezione and Il Trionfo del Tempo. By 1710, the itinerant Handel had ended up in England, and it was in 1712 that he was living there permanently. He was now receiving a yearly income of £200 from Queen Anne, having composed for her the Utrecht Te Deum and the Jubilate. Many of Handel's most famous works were written during this time in London. It was in 1717 that the water music received its premiere on the River Thames amid a flotilla of boats and barges as King George I sailed from Whitehall Palace towards Chelsea. Oratorio developed in Italy during the late Renaissance and the early Baroque periods after an interest in highly dramatic texts had given rise to the first operas. Many believe that the form originated in Filippo Neri's Roman oratory, where a style of service had developed over the course of the late 16th century. Those present at Neri's informal prayer meetings often sang spiritual laudes, originally simple songs of praise, for entertainment. As these meetings grew in popularity, the congregation was formally recognised by Pope Gregory XIII, and the order was officially housed in the Chiesa Nuova in Rome. The music that was performed at these oratories became increasingly more complex and began to be performed by professionals in services where music was at the forefront of worship. Eventually, large-scale works by the likes of Carissimi and Marazzoli began to be composed for performance around the normal liturgy of the service. As the popularity of the form increased, so the musical techniques in these works developed. By the 17th century, composers employed the use of soloists to portray different characters, in addition to a chorus that would represent groups within the drama and at times comment on the action. Composers began dividing their works in two, labelling each section prima and secunda, with each section concluding with a chorus. Numerous composers throughout Europe were now making use of this new compositional form. In Naples, it was Scarlatti. In Vienna, Caldara and Hasse were producing oratorios for an annual series. In Germany, the oratorio form was being used by the likes of Schutz, Telemann and C.P.E. Bach. Handel arrived from Italy into an England that was unfamiliar with the oratorio form, and his compositions in this genre were a far cry from the church's verse anthems and even the secular masques with which the English public would have been familiar. Handel's oratorios were usually in 3 acts, between which concertos were often performed, and generally were settings of religious texts which told a story. They made dramatic use of the chorus and combined elements of Italian opera and English sacred choral music. The first such work that Handel composed for the English market was Esther, and he wrote this in 1718. Typically for Handel, he borrowed material that he had already composed, in this case from his Bruck's Passion, which he had written 2 years previously for the German market. The bass aria, Turn Not, O Queen, is reworked from the Bruck's Passion aria, Mein Vater, Mein Vater. It is a yearning and a heartfelt piece in which the character of Haman implores Esther to pardon him as he is sentenced to death. This is a performance in which I sing the aria, and I am accompanied on the harpsichord by Ben Cunningham. Some of the works that are today viewed as oratorios may not have been thought of as such in Handel's time, mainly due to their secular texts. An example is the musical drama Semele, which was originally described in the advertising for its 1744 Covent Garden premiere as being after the manner of an oratorio. It is composed in the same format as Handel's religious oratorios, but takes the story of Semele from Ovid's Metamorphoses, which seems to have caused some raised eyebrows, since the portrayal of Semele's relationship with her lover Jove was considered indelicate, especially as the work was first performed during Lent. In Italy, the performances of opera had been banned in Lent, and this may have been the inspiration for this secular work, although there was no such law in England. Here is a performance of O Sleep, Why Dost Thou Leave Me, a short aria from Semele, and it's performed by soprano Lucy Cox and harpist Aileen Henry. In it, the title character is waking up from her dream of being with her lover, the god Jove, and wishing to return to her dream of him. L'Allegro also falls into this uniquely Handelian category of secular oratorio. Perhaps even more so than Semele, it pushes the boundaries of the form's definition. The soloists do not appear as specific characters, instead creating a dramatic tension through a dialogue between two of Milton's poems, L'Allegro, the cheerful, and Il Penseroso, the thoughtful, while Handel's librettist Charles Jennens wrote a poem, Il Moderato, or the moderate man, for the third act. Here is a recording of the aria Mirth, Admit Me of Thy Crew, in which I am accompanied by harpsichordist Oliver John Riven. The aria comes towards the end of the first act and personifies l'allegro, or the cheerful man, as is reflected in the upbeat triple-time rhythm.
If I give thee honour due, mirth, admit me of thy crew. Mirth, admit me of thy crew. Mirth, admit me of thy crew. Mirth, admit me. Admit me, mirth, admit me. Admit me of thy crew. To listen how the hounds and horn and horn, chilly rouse, chilly rouse, the slumbering morn. From the side of some hill, through the high wood,
In 1732, a private, staged performance of the Oratorio Esther was given by the boy trebles of the Chapel Royal in the Crown and Anchor Tavern for the Philharmonic Society. The public staging of performances of sacred works was forbidden in England, and the Bishop of London at the time, Edmund Gibson, was said to have disapproved of the involvement of the Chapel Royal's boys. Bishop Edmund prevented the work from being publicly staged, and so Esther's public performance was instead presented unstaged in a revised concert version and performed by adult professional musicians. No other instances of staged oratorio performances are known from Handel's time. The success of the reworked Esther led Handel to compose two more works for this unstaged style of performance the following year, Deborah and Atalia. Both set biblical stories, and Deborah contains material taken by Handel from several of his previous compositions, including the Brock's Passion and Dixit Dominus. Atalia was commissioned for a ceremony in Oxford and was premiered to great acclaim at the Sheldonian Theatre. Here is one of Abner's arias from Atalia, in which I am accompanied by Ben Cunningham. Abner is captain of the Jewish forces and is about to warn the high priest that Queen Atalia intends to search the temple. Typical of many Handelian bass arias, is full of bluster and boisterousness. In the original performance of Atalia, the accompanying word book assigned this aria to an anonymous priest. Handel later clarified that this bass air was in fact in Abner's part.
When he is in his wrath revealed, where will the haughty lie concealed? When storms the crowds to terror's doom, he forms the dark majestic scene. He forms the dark majestic scene. When storms the proud to terror's doom, he forms the dark majestic scene. He forms the dark majestic scene. He rolls the thunder through the gloom. He rolls the thunder through the gloom. And on the whirlwind, right serene, he rolls the thunder. He rolls the thunder. He rolls the thunder through the gloom. And on the whirlwind, right serene, on the whirlwind, right serene, and on the whirlwind, right serene, he rolls the thunder, through the gloom. And on the whirlwind, right serene, and on the whirlwind, right serene, and on the whirlwind, right serene.
From 1738 to 1745, Handel wrote 6 oratorios, having been focused on composing Italian opera in the intervening years. These included an unusual work with no specific storyline, which instead took biblical texts from the Old and the New Testaments. This piece, Messiah, became Handel's best-known oratorio, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that later on. After the failure of the 1745 Second Jacobean Uprising, Handel composed 3 oratorios which took on a more militaristic style. Judas Maccabeus, Alexander Ballas, and Joshua all have subject matter about victory in battle, and these Old Testament stories with their religious wars would likely have appealed to a London public who were celebrating the Hanoverian victory over the invading Jacobites. The character Axa in Joshua sings an air in the final act of the work which is full of joy and celebration. It is sung here by Lucy Cox and accompanied on the harpsichord by William Cole. Solomon and Susanna were both composed in 1748 and appear to have been written by the same anonymous librettist. Handel's only composition during the summer of 1749 was Theodora, which is said to have been his favourite of his oratorios, telling the tale of 2 Christian martyrs. Jephthah was his final oratorio, premiered in 1752, when Handel was in ill health and his sight was beginning to deteriorate. It was classical drama that had the biggest impact on the work of Handel's librettists. Writers wanted to incorporate as much of the spirit and technique of Greek drama into their works as possible. They wanted the chorus to function from within the drama or to comment on the unfolding narrative before them. Handel engaged fully with the idea of harnessing the power of the chorus, and as a result, his choruses are noted for their stylistic variety. Some are predominantly simple in texture, others are full of huge chordal effects and double chorus antiphony. He also uses other more complex compositional techniques, like fugues, where the theme is imitated in different voices with a counter melody underneath, and bass ostinato, a repeated bass line. Others sound more like motets or madrigals. Handel's contrast in texture, melody, rhythm, and harmony are frequent, and no more so in 2 of his famous chorus-dominated works, Israel in Egypt and Messiah.
Wonderful Counselor, Almighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace.
Although Handel embraced variety in the compositional form of his oratorio chorus writing, it was in arias that the form was a little more rigid. The da capo form, which appeared throughout the Baroque era, was usually reserved for opera. The form is made up of 3 sections. The first section is a complete musical entity. It could, in principle, be performed alone. The second section will contrast with the first in its musical key, its texture and mood. The third section was often not written out by the composer, who rather simply specified the direction da capo, which is Italian for from the head, which meant that the first section should be repeated in full. Singers were expected to improvise an ornament during the third section, to keep it from being a mere repetition of the first. This enabled singers to demonstrate their vocal virtuosity in time-honoured tradition of showing off. Written in 1741 with a spiritual text compiled by Charles Jennens 2 years previously, Messiah's first performance had followed a series of successful subscription concerts that Handel had given in Dublin from December 1741 to June 1742. Messiah was the climax of the Dublin season, receiving a public rehearsal and 2 performances for the benefit of 3 charities. It was Charles Jennens' intentions that Messiah should be performed in London during Passion Week, as staged entertainments didn't happen during this time and the season was appropriate to the oratorio's subject matter. Messiah wasn't always as popular as it is today. When Handel first introduced it to London audiences, the reception was mixed, with the press objecting to the singing of scripture in theatre and to its title, Messiah. A correspondent in the Universal Spectator asked whether or not an oratorio
is an act of religion. If it is, I ask if the playhouse is a fit temple to perform it in. On the other hand, if it is for diversion and amusement only, what a profanation of God's name and word it is to make so light use of them.
After this reception, Handel retitled the work A New Sacred Oratorio, and it was not performed again until 1745, and then again in 1749. It was during this time that Handel's relationship with the Foundling Hospital began to flourish, and he was appointed a governor. It was at the hospital that the annual charity performances of Messiah began, and these continued beyond Handel's death. The popularity of Messiah continued to grow during Handel's lifetime, and the composer conducted the majority of the annual performances of the piece at the Foundling Hospital. The final time he heard the oratorio was at a performance at Covent Garden in 1759. He died just 8 days later. After Handel's death, Messiah continued to be performed at festivals and in churches across Great Britain and further afield. 10 years after he had died, there had been performances in Florence, New York, Hamburg, and in Mannheim, where it was heard by a young Mozart. His oratorios found favour with the public and his patrons and made him famous across Europe. Today, most of the world will instantly recognise many of Handel's works, from the Messiah's Hallelujah Chorus to the opening of Zadok the Priest. The enduring nature of his music, its ability to cross borders, to cross continents, and its importance in culture today is testament to his phenomenal ability as a composer and as a musician.